You don't have another table, do you? It seems to me the other night there were 2 tables, yeah. You don't?
Another one? No.
Okay.
What's that? They're gonna bring one.
Whenever we're ready. Okay. Good morning. First thing I need to say is I need you all to be tweeting now that you are in the best session of the conference and that people should be flooding in here. I've heard that really works. Because this is real, I'm really excited about this conference. My name is Rob Kunzig. I'm the environment editor of National Geographic, and I don't really know what's going on with cars. I find it a deeply confusing subject, and so with my colleagues, I've assembled a panel to instruct you and me about the future of cars and try to give us a bit of some sort of a roadmap. And we have quite a range of guests and experts here. Emil Frankel works at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and if you've heard him talk, you'll have noticed that he's a very reasonable-sounding guy and a good listener, so it makes sense that he's engaged in bipartisanship. He's also an expert on transportation policy. He has worked we're assistant secretary at DOT in the Bush administration, the last Bush administration. Teaches at Yale, thinks about this stuff a lot. Mary Beth Stanek wears a very complicated hat at General Motors that I didn't quite grasp, but she has responsibility for their advanced technology division, and they're advanced technology people. There's a book that I recommend to you all called Reinventing the Automobile that contains a way out, sounds like way out, but really not that far out vision of the future of automobiles. And one of the really interesting things about it is it was written by 2 guys at GM. Mary Beth is going to tell us a little bit about that. Lonnie Johnson, next to her, invented the Super Soaker. Got to say that right away. Became a very wealthy man. Also helped the Galileo spacecraft be tremendously successful at Jupiter with one of his inventions that kept its memory from draining, I think. And he's now working on a battery that's going to transform the automotive industry. If that's not an exaggeration. so secret that you can't read about it on his website, but you are going to hear about it here today. Niel Golithy is the Vice President of Communications for Royal Dutch Shell based in London and is responsible for all downstream communications. That means everything after it comes out of the ground and makes its way to us. And so he is going to give us an oil company perspective on the future of car, because obviously the oil industry has an interest in the subject. But I wanted to start, I've been working on an article on cities lately, and if you go around talking to urban planners, you will meet a few who are just convinced in their bones that the car is a fossil and it's dead. That, I mean, if you just think about it, look at our own cities, now try to imagine China like our own cities, but with 1.3 billion people, India. There's just sort of a general sense, how is this going to work? It's not going to work. So very quickly, we're going to go around the panel and see if we can find anyone who agrees with that position. Emil, what do you think in 2100 there still will be personal automobiles?
Let me say...
And why?
Yeah, let me...
This is not your opening speech now.
Right. No, I know, but I do want to say that my comments will really be focused on the United States. I really don't feel in a position to talk about China or India or other places where this is going to explode, and is. But the short answer to your question is yes. I think the automobile is with us. Our culture, certainly for the years, arguably before, but certainly the years since the Second World War, so 75 years or so has been built around the automobile. For good or ill, there have been some obviously enormously positive aspects to independent mobility and all the other things, the economy. And I'm not now talking primarily about automobile manufacturing. I'm talking about the whole structure of our economy and the mobility that's built in the metropolitan regions because of people's expansion of labor markets and labor reach on the part of businesses, all of which is enabled by the automobile. So I think the automobile is with us. I think it's going to be a fundamental part of American society and the American economy indefinitely. But I do want to add, because we'll come back and talk about this, but our dependence on oil has to change.
Okay. Mary Beth.
I do think it'll be here, and I do think it'll be a different type of discussion. It'll be about mobility. It'll be personal as well as connected. And so that would include everything from an individual all the way through mass transit. So, but I do think it'll have a very large place in 2100. Mm-hmm. I do.
Lonnie?
I agree as well. I think automobiles represent a very important means for creating independence, free activity, free thought. And I think that that's a cornerstone of our way of life.
I'm not getting a lot of controversy here. I guess I should have invited one of those urban planners here.
Yeah. Personal mobility will be with us forever. Personal mobility is about access to opportunity, access to markets, access to education. It's a way of lifting communities out of poverty. 3 things will change, though, at least, and probably more than that, but at least 3 things will change by the end of the century. The dominance of the personal automobile as a means of transportation, I think, will change. There'll be much more variety and much more flexibility of different kinds of transportation for individuals. The model for ownership of automobiles will likely change fairly dramatically, and the fuel that drives automobiles will change dramatically.
Okay. All right. Let's go back to the beginning. Emil, you're, I know, more interested in problems of the United States, problems of the immediate future. In the United States, transport accounts for something like a third of our CO2 emissions. Cars have exploded our cities. We've got all sorts of problems that are related to cars. What do you think are what do you think are the current issues, and what sort of policy measures could help and could plausibly help?
Well, I think we have to be clear about the objective, and I think we are certainly at our work on transportation at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and that is reducing oil dependence. And I really want to focus on that more. It is true that the transportation sector contributes, give or take, 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. But to me, the extraordinary thing, which I think people will nod because they know it, but it's still pretty astounding, the transportation sector is the only major part of the American economy which is, for all intents and purposes, totally dependent on liquid petroleum. 96 or 97%. And 70% 70% of the oil used in the United States is used in the transportation system. The United States does not have an oil addiction. The American transportation system has an oil addiction, and to the extent we have national security issues, because much of that, it's probably going to go down, frankly, but nonetheless, much of that is foreign sourced. But more importantly, this is a global commodity, and Niel can speak to this certainly better than I, but it's a global commodity. Prices are going up, and will continue to trend up. There'll be peaks and valleys, but they'll continue to trend up because of kind of the thing you were talking about, international demand. This is demand-driven primarily. And the impacts on the economy because of the price of gasoline, if you will, in particular, and its impact as it works through the transportation system, and those costs are all reflected. And as I said, the national security issues, what Tom Friedman writes about, maybe a little bit offhandedly, but nonetheless, that when we're going to the pump and paying for gasoline, a lot of that money is ending up in the hands of people who don't really want to do nice things to the United States or the American people. It is the oil dependence of American transportation is totally unacceptable in terms of national security and the national interest. And we have got, with urgency, I mean now, not 2020 or 2050 or 2100, but now. But I'm focused on kind of the incremental steps. We'll be talking about that now. We have to, what can we do, not necessarily to go from, 100%, almost 96% dependence to zero. I mean, that's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. I don't think it has to happen, but we do have to take steps in terms of largely technology, but also issues in terms of planning and land use controls and other issues that can create more efficient utilization, increasing throughput, if you will, in our transportation system by the application of information technologies to the transportation system and to individual vehicles.
Let's get more concrete. What's the single biggest thing we need to be doing?
Well, I think,
do we need to be drilling in Texas? Do we need to be, is it more supply? Is it
I think it's a combination of two things. One of which is price. I think, unfortunately, the good thing about prices going up is it's going to force people to look for, probably make purchase decisions. I think to change lifestyles in the short run is quite difficult. But I think certainly in terms of how they use their automobile, but particularly as they make purchase decisions about looking for more efficient automobiles. So the price
influence people's decisions. How should
well,
we
I
be
think
doing
we
that?
should. I think the market is doing that in terms of international demand. But I also, although it doesn't seem like it's likely to happen anytime soon, we do need to increase the transportation, particularly the use of the private automobile on our system is underpriced. By far, it doesn't absorb externalities, whether we do that through taxation, which doesn't seem to be likely in the short run, user charges, whatever. We do need to make transportation, I won't say more, private automobile transportation more expensive, but we do have to incorporate prices. The other thing is, and I'm a Republican, I'm not a big believer in command and control regulation, but in this case, I do think continue to drive, and I think it's really going to be the CAFE standards. I don't know what is going to happen with the emissions standards. They now kind of, as you all know, move kind of hand in hand. But I don't know what the future of the greenhouse gas emission standards at EPA, but the CAFE standards have been with us since the early 1970s. They're moving up now for the first time after a 30-year stagnation. I think there needs to be continued increasing of those regulations, of those standards and applications to other parts of the vehicle fleet, which is now being talked about.
Yeah. So those of us, we're talking to people here who are obviously motivated heavily by environmental issues, but if we want to reach out to the people and find common ground with people who are interested more in energy security issues, is it plausible that we can become independent of foreign oil mostly by increasing our supply? Just give us a sense, how big a portion is it, or is that really a mirage?
I think I wouldn't necessarily
what
use
are the
the word
numbers?
mirage, but I've seen different figures in terms of our dependence on foreign oil, but the main thing is it's an international commodity. We could be totally, and again, Niel can speak to this better than I, but we could be totally domestic sourced, and frankly, our biggest source of quote unquote foreign oil now is Canada and its tar sands, which isn't real good for the environment, but that's a reality. But the fact of the matter is it's an international commodity, and it's going to be reflective of increasing demand or interruptions with the political changes occurring in the Middle East. We could have a really significant interruption of oil from the Middle East at some point in the next several years. And even if the United States transportation system was totally dependent on domestic sources, there would be a huge spike in prices as a result of that kind of disruption. So the effect of international demand and international disruption, I think, reflects in its ability to impact how we use oil, the availability of oil, and how much it will cost, requires us to move away from it as a national security and economic matter.
Yeah. Neil, what do you think of that as our oil industry representative? What does thinking about trying to make the U.S. independent of foreign oil even make sense in a global oil market?
Well, so I think there's a very useful conversation to be had around America's energy resources and how best to develop them and how best to use them. I think if you pan back a little bit and think about mobility in a more kind of global aspect, some people may be surprised to hear this. I don't think there are very many people at Shell who believe that the current model around mobility is sustainable over the long term. It does have to change, and it has to change for a variety of reasons, among them energy security, climate change, and simply the long-term availability of fossil fuels. So the question then becomes, as society grapples with the larger kind of questions about what should mobility look like, what can a company like ours do to really look at what that future looks like? And there are basically kind of two phases. And it's slightly schizophrenic because in the long haul, we want to be part of the solution that we may end up getting to at some point, whether it's hydrogen-based fuel cells, whether it's next-generation biofuels, whether it's something around electricity. And there's a lot of work being done on what that future looks like. In the meantime, though, how do we manage in the short term? How do we make sure that the issues associated with CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, efficiency, are best managed, and what can we do in that space? And there we look at a variety of different, at least 3 different strategies, all bundled under what we our bumper sticker label for it inside Shell is smarter mobility. And we look at 3 different strategies. One is products. What can we put into the market today? Not 15, 20 years from now. That we're working on that too. But what can we do today that will reduce the CO2 in the fuel mix? We look at smarter use. How can we encourage and help our customers use our product much more efficiently and much better? And we're also looking at smarter infrastructure. In the short term, that's things like, are there more energy-efficient ways to pave roads? Longer term, that may be getting into conversations with big cities around city planning. Mm-hmm. So it is a two-wave approach, long-term, short-term.
And so I think you were telling us you made a big bet on, you guys are heavy believers in biofuels. You're investing in some big new plant in Brazil to make biofuels out of sugar cane. So that's where you think the immediate future for...
We think so very strongly for a variety of reasons. One is part of the reason why there is such a predominance of liquid fossil fuels today is it's an efficient way to package energy. Liquid fuels are an efficient way to package energy to put in your car. And many of the challenges that people are working on electric vehicles, for example, are how can we achieve that same efficiency of packaging energy? So liquid fuels. So what's a better approach to liquid fuels? A lower CO2, more sustainable approach to liquid fuels. Biofuels, if you look again at that 10, 15, 20-year range, looks to us like the best way in the short term to address the question around reducing CO2. It is the most commercially viable way. A lot depends on how you do it. Mm-hmm. Feedstock, the processes. It's very important that those be managed very carefully. The $12 billion JV that we're just about to announce, it's probably will be announced later today. The news has been out, but it actually gets launched today in Brazil around sugarcane ethanol with our partners Cosan in Brazil is a good example of the magnitude of the bet that we're making on biofuels.
So why is sugarcane? I mean, the next plenary, it's either today or tomorrow, I think it's the next one, is going to be talking about how are we going to feed 9 billion people. And one of the issues, of course, is agricultural land. Any biofuel takes land that could be cropland. Why is sugarcane? Why is it good to burn that stuff in our cars?
So when we started to ramp up our activity in biofuels over the last few years, we've been in biofuels for 30 years, but mainly as a buyer and distributor. But as we started to ramp up our actual business activity in biofuels, one of the very first criteria that we looked at is it sustainable? Is it socially acceptable? And there was such a range of different kinds of feedstock, everything from corn to soy to palm oil to sugarcane. And it was very, very important to the business to ensure that we were looking at the most sustainable from a CO2 point of view and from a production point of view. And right now, sugarcane looks to be that commodity or that feedstock that is the most sustainable. That's why we focused on Brazil. Dan Kamen, I think, is in the audience here. He's doing a lot of work on land use associated with biofuels, indirect and direct. That's part of the whole calculation that we look at when we make these
what is it
decisions.
about sugarcane? Why doesn't using a whole lot of sugarcane and burning it in our cars take away land that we could be using for food? I mean,
So there are a couple of things. One is in terms of just the sheer size of Brazil. So when I went to Brazil to see some of the mills that we will be now involved in as part of this JV, I was struck by the fact that Brazil is about the size of the United States, if not bigger. So the land that's being used for sugarcane is not being displaced. It's not displacing land that would have been used for any other agricultural commodities, food commodities. It's about 2,000 kilometers away from the rainforest. We think there's a minimum risk, not a zero risk, but a minimum risk that will displace some land activities in the rainforest. And from a feedstock point of view, sugarcane looks to be the most CO2 effective of the various feedstocks that are commercially viable for us. A roughly 70, some people say actually 90% reduction in CO2 versus conventional petrol. So those are all the reasons why we focused on Brazil and sugarcane. And there's some commercial. I mean, Brazil has a very, very extensive infrastructure around ethanol already in its market. So there are also some commercial reasons to go to Brazil, but those are among them.
Mary Beth, so now we hear a vision that says, well, we're going to keep driving. Oh, I forgot to ask you. How long is the planet still going to be dominated by cars burning gasoline? In your view or in Shell's view?
Whether any of us like it or not, I think it's going to be into the middle of the century that we're still well over 50%, probably
gasoline.
Towards
and then a whole bunch more than that biofuel.
Biofuel or others.
So still basically the same kind of infrastructure that we have now will be, maybe a lot of us will be pumping sugarcane juice into our cars instead of oil, but still the world will still look the same. Now, how does GM see that?
Well, this is a very good setup here. I would say that a couple things we need to really think about. This is not only for mobility, but for stationary application. The energy needs 50 years from now are going to double. Okay, so given that, whether you want to accept that or not, it's really happening. It's population growth, it's city density, it's wealth creation. We know this to be a fairly robust statistic. So we have to address that. So how do we go about addressing that? We need liquid fuels, we need electrification, we need all sorts of options. So one of the things I want to address very quickly is that we're working on a number of fronts, and the reason is because every option is viable. It has a good part to it, and it has a trade-off, of course. But we can't take any of these options off the table. So when you're hearing a lot of confused energy speak going on, whether it's in the Beltway or outside, it's not the time to be picking winners or losers because we really need to address this sizable challenge we have. So for us at General Motors, we're looking at a number of things. Obviously, the most immediate aspect is efficient internal combustion engines. It was mentioned earlier on here that we're going to smaller boosted engines. We're electrifying a little bit. We're hybriding them, and again, that'll stretch that gallon of gasoline. But we're taking it a little bit farther, not only from making vehicles more efficient, more lightweighting, et cetera, we're making them more towards the electrification side, which is less on liquid fuels, but more on looking at existing infrastructure around the world where you can plug in. Also hydrogen.
Mary Beth, let me stop you there. I didn't quite follow that. That was a little abstract for me. What you're making combustion engines more efficient when you're looking also at the electrification side. You're talking about you're going to focus more on hybrid?
Sure. I guess the best way to kind of package
maybe
it.
Define these.
Yeah, package it as a continuum. Mm-hmm. So on a continuum, you would start out with what the technology we're all using today, which is an internal combustion engine. Mm-hmm. We do support bio-based fuels. We support the activities that are going on. Probably not enough time to get into it today, but certainly tomorrow. There's a lot of biofuels that can be made from waste products and not, we'll call it protein products. Mm-hmm. So you can also be addressing use for feeding more people taking the waste from that and turning that into fuel, which I think is how you're going to see that split off in the future. So I think there's good news on that horizon. The protein will get to the people, the waste will get to the fuel. And so that's where we're going to see all this maturing with the internal combustion engine. You're going to see more efficient engines. We can probably harvest another 15-20% out of engines as we know today through a number of things, variable valve timing, e-assist, and a lot of approaches. So that's one solid space. Then you would add on the continuum hybridization, and there's going to be a variety of it. It is not going to be standardized between OEMs or even within OEMs.
Between what?
Between automakers.
Okay.
So original equipment manufacturers.
And hybrids just
Okay.
for people who are a little bit like me, slow on this stuff.
Oh,
A hybrid is a car that
A hybrid
has
is a
an
car
electric
that
motor and
it-
also a gasoline
It
motor.
definitely is a gasoline motor, and it has a hybrid motor, and is electrified in some way. You can have electrons being created either through regenerative braking, or you can have a battery that is actually propelling the car. So there's everything in between, all the way through to a pure battery driving the car exclusively, which is known as an EV vehicle. And there's also a hydrogen vehicle, which is really an electrified vehicle. It's just making the electrons from hydrogen. Okay? So essentially, you have this continuum of options, and what we're seeing is people are picking on it. And they're saying, I really believe in the biofuel space, or I really believe in the hydrogen space, or I really believe it's a mix in between. And the truth is you need every bit of this. Consumers are different. You're going to see a lot of regionalism. An electrified vehicle in an urban space makes a lot of sense. We were talking earlier about these large mega cities, these congested cities. How does individual mobility fit into this space? It's very difficult. So you have to look at very small NV vehicles, which were mentioned. And an NV vehicle is an electric networked vehicle. And what it's meant to be, it's sort of like individual mobility. However, when it senses another vehicle and it's present, it connects to it, keeps a safe distance from it, and they begin what we call platooning. And they're all working together, and they become like public transportation. So it's like a train, or it's like a bus.
Or as your colleagues in this book say it, it's more, we all become more like packets on the internet, right?
Yes.
There'll be big car routers switching us. You'll get in your car and say, well, I'm going to work, but who knows which way I'm going to go.
Exactly.
Yes. And there'll be some giant router.
It would work. It would function like that.
Reducing congestion of people by routing us down the most efficient path.
Avoiding accidents, avoiding, we'll say construction and such. But there's phases to that. First, we have to get the vehicles to talk to each other. They're doing it now. Many of you have vehicles that if you're kind of veering out of your lane, it puts you back in or senses another vehicle. That's in its infancy. Where it's going is substantial. But
GM believes in this vision long term.
Absolutely. But we also believe that, outside the urban area, the needs are going to be different. If you clearly look, we'll pick the United States. We're here, central states, a lot of distances between things, a lot of domestic fuel being generated there that doesn't necessarily want to move out of the country or move to the coast. It's going to be produced and sold there and sold affordably with a predictable price point. So I foresee in those central states, utility vehicles that are people's offices on wheels, riding on biofuels, we'll say with a high percentage of biofuel-based fuel, and they're getting them to and fro. But they don't need an electric vehicle that takes them 40 miles because they may be going hundreds of miles a day. In an urban setting, you may only need 40 miles, and that was one of the decisions with the Volt, which was truly learnings from our EV1, is that people have range anxiety, and it's still showing up in the statistics. So if most of their driving, if 70% of most people around the world drive less than about 40 miles a day, and if you can make that pure electric and they can get the job done, why not? But if there's that instance where they need to go farther, give them the option for the gasoline range that's required, or a biofuel-based, or whatever you want the other biofuel component to be. So what this allows you to do is have energy fiat. You can say, today I'm...
again? Energy what?
Fiat. Bargaining. You can say, okay, I'm looking at the price of ethanol today. It's not good. I'm going with gasoline. Or gasoline is too erratic again, or diesel. I'm going to the ethanol side. Or in the case of electrification, I'm going to drive pure battery, but you may be in a state that's having electrical rates that are going up so high, and you may use gasoline component.
And one car is going to do it all.
Not one car. No. There does come a point where if you put biofuel, tri-fuel in, where the cost of the vehicle becomes too expensive, plus you have a whole factory going on underneath the car. It makes no sense from the weight and everything else. So you're going to see biofuel options companioned together, like a flex fuel vehicle would have biofuel, would be ethanol and gasoline. Electric vehicle like our Volt that you're all, I hope, taking a test drive in, is pure electric miles for 40, and then you have gasoline extension if you need.
Yeah.
So you'll see these combinations. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I know people want us to get pure EV or pure CNG or pure hydrogen. We're ready to do that, but we're also in a change-up time. It seems very short to everyone here, but very long, but short really in times of an automotive life. We're only in the first 125 years of maybe automobile life. We're going to have many more years of it. We have to get through this change period. So the biofuel is necessary until infrastructure truly change. But one thing we also talked about is how will infrastructure change? Which one's going to win out? And that's where I think most people find this very unsettling. It isn't going to be one option. So you're going to have the liquid fuels, as was mentioned earlier, and that would include gasoline, diesel, the biofuel-based fuels. You're going to have CNG and LPG. You're also going to have improved batteries, and you're going to have improved fuel cell options. So that means all the companion infrastructures, whether it's investing in the grids around the world, investing into liquid fuels, is going to have to continue. So we're going to have some very ferocious arguments here on which one gets prioritized for the next 5 years to address the question here of immediacy, all the way through the 2100 view of the world, which will probably be a more electrified world.
So no one knows what's happening in 2100, but in the next 20 years, what does GM expect to be selling? What percentage of ordinary old gas cars, what percentage of Volts, what percentage of hybrids?
Well, I think that is the million-dollar question. It's the one we avoid the most when we have to actually put numbers on it.
It's a very small audience. No one.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. No one has a BlackBerry or anything else. Yeah. But I would say that we definitely see, obviously increased electrification. But to turn over the fleet, this is a fleet. Vehicles, people are in their vehicles a lot longer. That's a good thing. So people realize, necessarily they didn't have to change every 3 years. Vehicles are lasting 10, 15 years. So let's use the U.S. base again because it's an easy thing to frame up. 240 million vehicles. We have 15-year cycling of these vehicles out. So predominantly we're going to have a gasoline mix with a very small percentage of electrified vehicles. And this would be hybrid all the way through fuel cells. But as you look more towards the 2025, 2035, and 50, you're going to see that electrified percentage increase, certainly beyond, I would say, 10%, 15%. But it'll take that much time just because it takes a long time to turn the fleet over. But on an annualized percentage, increased electrified options as a percentage of new sales will be increasing at a far larger rate than that.
So in a way, this is like, maybe you know the history better than I do, but when cars started, we had some electric cars. We had some steamers running around, and then there was a sort of a shakeout period. And then we had a century of bliss and beauty where the system was just easy and you could take your vehicle anywhere and fill it up at any filling station. They were all over the place. And you're saying now we're entering a period of turbulence and confusion where people are going to be driving all different sorts of things. And
I don't think it's confusion. I think it's accepting that there will be a variety of pathways. Now, fighting for funding and investment to get to your job done will be much harder because there isn't one that's going to supplant the other. That's where the difficulty is. And I think the history of electric vehicle is just fascinating because you really have to ask yourself, what have we overcome and where do we still have work? If you look back in particular in Europe at turn of the century, electrified vehicles were very predominant in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Paris, and they were a large percentage in city centers. And there
this was when? Around 1910?
I would say 1910, 1915.
Be careful when you say turn of the century.
That's a good point. You're right. Sorry about that. That's my own self-dating myself. But so we'll say around 1910. And what they did is everything was in place that we're seeing very mirroring today. There was policies to ensure that there were incentives for electric vehicles in cities to keep the noise down, to keep the cities cleaner. There was actually pooling of vehicles because you wanted to make sure that you could have a station where you could go in and charge a battery and change it out. In order for those stations to make money, they had to know there was a certain percentage of electrified vehicles in the city because that particular station wouldn't make any money if there were too few electrified vehicles. We're seeing the same thing with some of the options. The notion of the service station, which we all know is a gas station where we go fill up and get a Twinkie and a Coke, actually came from European battery swapping and charging stations. That's where the whole definition of service station came from. It was pooling enough electrified vehicles to change them out, keep them healthy, keep their money. They were in taxi cabs. And have you not heard this in major cities? Let's make the taxi services all electrified. So they had some obstacles there, and then the gas car came in, and the range was too breathtaking. And it was akin to racing. You got greater performance, greater acceleration. This was debated amongst automotive experts at the time. They could prove the electric vehicle could go as fast, but they couldn't beat the range. Okay, so that was an option that, again, we're all working on, and we'll get to this gentleman here. He'll tell you some really exciting news in that front. The other issue they had at the time, which I think we have overcome, is the electric vehicle was considered very feminine. So men really liked the gasoline vehicle, and they were the largest purchaser of vehicles. I don't think that's the case now. I think we're groovy with all of that side of that.
Right.
And
what's good for women is good for the planet.
Yes, I'm glad that's being restated there. So so that was one thing. Where I do think we have had a breakthrough has been with the substitution of lithium. And what we'll talk about in a little bit is some of the things that are coming on the horizon, which are even going to be more breathtaking with materials to help us get there. So I don't mean to get long-winded. I'm just saying, this movie has been seen before. The question is, are we at a point where it's going to really be a tipping point, which is really what you want to know. When is the tipping point and what percentage? I think we're there, and I think we're going to see, more than anything else, great advancements in technology, costs coming down, greater performance, greater durability, which will help accelerate the amount of electrified vehicles by the 2100 time.
So you're not going to kill the electric car again, are you?
We never did.
I know, it's a canard.
He's
you don't have
me
to
off.
answer that.
Okay, all right, okay.
Lonnie, you're the far horizon, the great vision, and it sounds to me like the car companies are a little confused, and they're saying we need everything. Do you believe that, or
No, I don't believe
Okay.
that, actually. In this country, our strength and our weaknesses are mirror images of each other. We're a nation of independent thinking, strong-willed people. And whereas other nations and leaders can choose a direction and basically move their countries in that direction and achieve their goals, we have to operate in an environment where we have a lot of debate, a lot of distractions, and even sometimes disinformation. In this environment, though, independent entrepreneurs often emerge with game-changing, out-of-the-box solutions that have implications far beyond anything that a bureaucratic process could generate. I also want to add that this is America. The world continues to look to America for leadership. I don't think we can afford to adapt Band-Aid or patchwork solutions or things that are barely adequate. We need to offer the world a sufficient and sustainable energy source that can enable all peoples to prosper. We need to move the world away from CO2 emissions as rapidly as we can. It's been discussed in other sessions, we need to take a systems approach. And if you were to do that, step back and say, look to the future and say, okay, what is an ideal solution? Then you can start making decisions and back away from that and start putting things in place now that enable that future to happen. For example, if we were to choose to focus on solar energy, which we all understand to be the single source that can supply all the future energy needs of the world in a sustainable way, then once we make that decision, the next step would be to look at vehicle electrification, because you're going to produce electricity from the sun, and you need a way, of course, of distributing that energy. And, of course, that means that you have to improve the national grid, and those things start to fall into place. For vehicles, that means improving battery technology. And so once you start doing that and looking at what the ideal future would be, you can start building things and putting things in place now that would enable us to have a sustainable environment. At my company, we have a philosophy that says that you get what you work on. If you work on incremental improvements, if you work on short-term solutions as patchwork, then you end up with incremental solutions. If you work on game-changing approaches, then you're going to end up with game-changing results. I attended a session yesterday on natural gas, and I was very concerned when I heard discussions about expanding our infrastructure for fracturing of shale to produce more natural gas. And I'm concerned that when you start putting those infrastructures in place, you create another industry that is going to fight for its survival. You will at that point have vested interest. You will have people profiting. You will have jobs being created, and those people are not going to want to give that up, and you will be faced with that kind of scenario. We've been trying to get off of oil since the 73 oil embargo, and I remember that very well. And we've been talking about it, but when you look to the energy industry for a solution, what the industry knows how to do is produce more oil and fossil fuels. And
so tell us what you're doing. You're working on batteries. What's the problem with batteries?
Why
has that been so hard for a century?
Well, the problem with batteries, as Mary Beth pointed out, people are concerned. They have range anxiety. We've managed to convince people that electric vehicles can actually outperform gasoline engines when it comes to acceleration and things like that. So it really is just a matter of how far can you go. My company is developing advanced battery technology. We're working on the next 2 generations of battery technology. The one that people are most excited about is lithium-air battery technology, whereas the auto industry right now is struggling to get to 100 miles on a single charge. This technology will allow you to go in excess of 1,000 miles on a single charge.
What's in the Volt? That's a lithium?
That's a lithium-ion battery.
Lithium-ion. Okay. So you're working on lithium-air. 60 kilowatt?
16.
16
40 miles, generally 35 to 40 miles in normal operating conditions.
So what's the difference between lithium-air and lithium-ion?
Well, lithium-ion, I like to refer to lithium-ion batteries as like rocket engines because you have oxidizer and fuel all in the same package. And there are safety issues associated with that, of course, because those batteries, if you have internal failures, can result in pretty catastrophic events, fires, and even...
They didn't tell me that out at the Volt stand when I test drove the test.
We have all that mitigated.
I did sign some release of it. So lithium-air...
Lithium-air batteries are different in that the oxidizer actually is from the ambient environment. So you pull oxygen into the battery, and you're still using lithium as a fuel. Lithium is actually a great fuel or energy source. In terms of energy density, it's right up there with gasoline, whereas gasoline is about 13,000 watt-hours per kilogram. Lithium is about 11,000. So it has the energy, yet when we process it into a battery, and when you put in all of the other components needed to make it a battery, you end up down around 200 watt-hours per kilogram. So lithium-air allows you to unlock more of that potential. So about 2,000 watt-hours per kilogram is our goal.
Because a lot of the stuff that has to be packaged into a lithium-ion, that other electric component you are taking out of the air, is that correct?
Right.
You're not carrying it in the car.
Right, correct.
So you get closer to the energy density, using less space in the car,
and less
using
weight.
it up to carry your fuel.
Right, and less weight.
Not as good as gas cars, but closer.
Actually, pretty comparable.
Okay.
Maybe even a little bit better. When you look at gasoline, for example, at 13,000 watt-hours per kilogram, engines are in the 35, I'll be generous and say 35% efficiency range. I should look at General Motors when I say that. So you're taking roughly about a third of that. So you're down now around 40 or so. And when you, 4,000. And when you start looking at other losses in the process of going from the engine to the drivetrain, and when you're operating at peak point versus off-peak performance points of the engine, you can end up in the 2,000 to 3,000 watt-hours per kilogram, which is in the same category as the battery. Our vision is to have enough energy stored in the battery that you would go in, or you'd be able to charge your battery after 1,000 or 2,000 miles, which means that changing your battery or charging your battery would be more like going in for an oil change, which means that relying on electric transportation actually becomes more attractive and more convenient to people.
Right now, these things, I think you told me, are not running anything. Lithium-air does not power any device, not even.
That's right.
Yeah, except you have a little toy car.
We have a little toy RC car that we are powering with lithium-air batteries.
So how long before we test drive a lithium?
Well, that
air
depends
car?
on how much support we get
Yeah.
in terms of transitioning the
Okay.
technology.
All right.
And there are a lot of vested interest involved in that. We, unfortunately, most of our work on this technology has been supported by the Department of Defense. Mm-hmm. There's been very little support from the Department of Energy, actually. And even Department of Energy, I could tell some horror stories about some of the experiences there.
But what's DOD interested in it for? What do they want to run their Jeeps in Afghanistan? Or
Well, it turns out that the military spends about, on batteries for soldiers, for example. We have about 150,000 troops deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq. We spend about $1,000 per week per soldier on batteries.
Yeah. Okay.
Not to mention the costs and risks of getting
fuels.
That's
right.
to combat positions or outlying positions.
Fuels to
tremendous motivation for DOD to
fuel
research
to combat positions cost about $400 per gallon.
Yes.
So would your vision be then, piecing together what you said, your vision of 2050 is a solar-powered planet with people driving lithium
That's
air,
right.
electric cars with lithium air batteries in it?
Absolutely.
Is there enough lithium on the planet?
Yes.
There's plenty of lithium? I don't know about lithium.
Yes.
It's not a scarce resource? Or?
It depends on what the demand is. There are land deposits, primarily Brazil and places like that, but the ocean has an abundant supply of lithium.
The ocean?
Yes. Salt water.
Salt.
The sea salt.
Wow.
So, yes. So there's
Is
sodium
Shell in the
chloride,
lithium
lithium
business?
chloride, and so forth. I'm sorry?
Is Shell in the lithium business? Not yet.
Not yet, but you can be excited.
Okay. All right, so we have gas-powered cars dominating till 2050 with a gradual increase in biofuel. We have a mix of gas-powered, steady increase of electrification, but really kind of a different cars for different uses.
Well,
gasoline probably still dominating to 2050.
I think that if the technology can be brought online quickly, I think people will demand it, and the adaptation will happen a lot sooner. I think a lot of the projections that people make are, and I was listening to Mary Beth earlier, a lot of the projections that people make are based on known technology limitations. And so we have a breakthrough in some way of changing the game, so to speak. I think people will demand it, and adaptation can come a lot quicker.
Yeah.
The timing is also, it's not only when technologies are developed and there's market acceptance and comfort with the technologies, but there's also, as Mary Beth emphasized, the rollover of the fleet. Our cars are lasting longer, and people don't want to, in tough economic times, people don't want to invest in a new car at any price. But there's also, we've touched on it, but I think it's worth emphasizing, that's the distributive infrastructure. And I know she and I were chatting earlier, was from the time when I was at USDOT, DOE, and DOT were cooperating very much, and kind of the flavor of the month was hydrogen fuel cells. I think there was a step back from that. I think the Obama administration dropped research work for the most part on hydrogen fuel cells, largely I think because of concern about recreating a new distributive infrastructure.
Yeah, maybe we should just explain.
Well, getting
hydrogen is sort of an alternative to batteries, right? It's an electric
companion. They go hand in hand. It depends.
But it requires getting hydrogen
infrastructure.
Reforming something, creating the hydrogen, which is used in this case in the fuel cell, and it requires a different distribution system from what we have, and we have a tremendous amount. I don't know, Neil. I mean, the amount invested in our existing kind of not only recovery, but I mean pipeline system and service stations, gas stations, and so forth. And nobody is stepping up to the plate to talk about who's going to pay for either creating a new distributive infrastructure or replacing or reforming the existing one. And so that's also a factor in how quickly we can make this transition, even if a new technology, let's say a battery technology. Listen, even plug-ins. I live in Washington, D.C., downtown Washington, D.C. I park our car, which incidentally we don't use very much, but nonetheless at the curb. I have no place to recharge a battery.
Yeah, but wouldn't that be a lot easier to do than
yes,
build a hydrogen
that's one of the no
gas
question.
station
I think one of the reasons and others here may want to correct me, I think one of the reasons there's been a step back from hydrogen fuel cell in terms of public investment in research and more attraction of electricity is because there's more infrastructure in place. We have generation, we have grid. We do have to deal only with kind of where those charging stations going to occur. So it's a more manageable and more easily imagined extension or replacement of a distributed infrastructure. But even there, the utilities seemingly have an interest in doing this and a willingness to do it, but there's still some transition. It's not going to happen overnight. Right. And I know we'll come back to this. I do want to say, in terms of my perspective in this urgency about reducing oil dependence, is that the steps that can be taken and the role of regulation in driving the automobile manufacturers to moving more towards improvements in our existing system, that is the internal combustion engine, not only the engine itself and the technology of the automobile, but also the weight of the automobile and reducing the weight of the automobile. You're not going to get, let's imagine, and I'll just throw this out, Mary Beth will probably dispute it, but let's imagine that the CAFE standard, instead of 35 or 38 miles to a gallon, which is what's now required by I think the 2016 model year, let's assume that there's continued pressure and that's driven to 50 miles to a gallon by 2025 or something like that, just hypothetically. It's pretty hard to imagine that can be achieved. There are technologies that are in use that have been applied to performance, not to efficiency, so applying those technologies in use in the automobile today, or technologies that are imagined and improvements of those technologies, that's probably possible, but it will have to be combined with reduction of the weight of the automobile, which means materials issues, design issues, safety concerns that people have. A lot of people drive around in big, huge SUVs. You know, mom's driving alone around downtown Westport, Connecticut, I can assure you, in these huge SUVs. And some of that's driven by safety concerns. Yeah. And that also has to be dealt with. And, as a matter of fact, NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which promulgates and administers the CAFE standards, the fuel efficiency standards, is required by the statute, the authorizing statute, to consider safety considerations, weighing and balancing safety with efficiency. So all of these things have to be dealt with, but I would say that it's more manageable in the short run, not 2050 or 2100, but over the next 15 years, really reducing oil use by improving the efficiency of the internal combustion engine and the vehicles which use the internal combustion engine, and combining that, because that technology is now with a greater balance of the hybridization to which Mary Beth referred, or greater use of electricity.
So I'm glad you mentioned the mom in the SUV, because it really introduces a voice that I'm not sure gets acknowledged enough in venues like this, which is the consumer voice and the power that the consumer has over all the kinds of decisions that we're talking about here. And if I think about a Shell experience, for example, about 10 years or so ago, we introduced a fuel in the Netherlands, which is a very green-conscious market. And this fuel, by the way, the fuels are different. So despite the fact that if you hold up a glass beaker of any kind of fuel, it looks kind of the same. There are many different kinds and varieties of fuel. And we offered one as a main grade in the Netherlands that was demonstrably and provably greener, cleaner, and more green, if you will, than its predecessor. And we charged for it because it cost more to make, and I think it was 2 or 3 cents per liter. It failed. Nobody was interested in it. However, we got a little bit smarter, and in fact, under sort of our smarter mobility rubric, we came back just within the last couple of years and offered a fuel that gets better mileage. About 2%, so that's about a liter of fuel per tank on average. We've introduced it in about 10 markets. And the consumer take-up of that has been enormous. It's been a tremendous success. And we put it into the market in part because of this notion that we need to be contributing to more efficient use of fuel, lower CO2 sort of per tank of fuel. But the way that the take-up in the market was because it saves money. It's more efficient. So thinking about how the consumer plays into all this, and thinking about how can we develop solutions that actually create more opportunity for efficient mobility rather than simply focusing on reducing impacts is a huge part of this whole equation.
One of the interesting, getting back to something you just said, Emil, was in the book talking about if we were willing to surrender ourselves to a network that hustled us around like packets, cars could be a lot lighter, right?
Oh, they could be much lighter.
And the whole structure of the car would change, and you would get huge efficiency gains just from that.
Even without going, and
because you wouldn't need all those
right,
those
and also with
protections.
even without going all the way there, but just the stuff which is now available in cars, that is the greater safety, crash avoidance systems, help that even without going all the way. We haven't scratched the surface in terms of the applications of these technologies. Forget the kind of the powering technologies, but the application of information technologies to the surface transportation sector. And there is much more that can be gained in terms of efficiency, arrived at a different kind of way, different from what we've been talking about here, but still substantial efficiencies that could be obtained, and also reducing that demand for and use of oil.
Yeah.
I think based on the comments they were all very good. I have one exception that I really do have to weigh in, and I hope there's a doctoral student out there that would take this subject on for us, because we need it to be worked on. And that is, the notionality of the battery and electrification and the charging, whether it be lithium air, lithium ion, et cetera, is so easy to get your head around. So people get it right away. The hydrogen is a little bit longer discussion. But the trade-offs, right now you can get great range, duty cycle. You can go 300 miles, and we've had a demonstration fleet in. We have 2 million miles on them. We believe it can work. I'm not sure the infrastructure investment is cheaper, easier to do. If I look at a hub and spoke approach, taking a Shell station, putting a hydrogen station in Washington, D.C., that can serve the multitude of cars around versus putting in a charging station outside and then doing the transformers back, I'm not sure the math is much different. So I think we need someone to do an honest job who doesn't have vested interest to say, what are the real costs of all these infrastructure options? Let's start with the biofuel mix. How far can we go with what we have? What would it take to increase more corrosive fuel blends into existing infrastructure? What do we do with hydrogen? What do we do? What's the real cost of electrification plug-in, especially for multi-dwelling and public? And I think we're going to probably get our heads around some better answers of priorities. I just don't. I think we've been too simplified on the charging part.
Well, I take
very briefly, because we got to give people a chance to ask questions.
Again, there's cost and things like that are drivers, but there are overbearing considerations like the environmental impact and so forth that you really want to consider. And hydrogen, for example, a lot of the work on hydrogen was focused on, because we submitted proposals to DOE back when the Bush administration announced the hydrogen economy. We had actually gone to DOE headquarters, made presentations, and they said, sure, this looks great. This is a new engine that I've invented. And so when the solicitation came out, they actually sent us emails. The solicitations are out now. Submit your proposals. So we got the solicitations, started going through it, and it was all about how to convert petroleum to hydrogen. which of course does not solve the problem. You still got the CO2 emissions and the whole 9 yards. So that to me was not a genuine consideration.
How about if you had renewables to this we have to find this doctoral student, so we'll do the cost, and then we'll model the CO2 for the renewables versus.
All right, let's open it up to questions here. Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks.
And please identify yourself.
Thanks. I'm John Sturman from the MIT Sloan School of Management, and I have doctoral students for you. We've been working on this issue of alternative fuel vehicles for some years and have a suite of models that look exactly at those issues, and there's already some theses I can share with you. So
what's the answer?
Don't have time for that right
Okay.
now.
And it's not free anyway.
So Lonnie called for systems thinking, and Dan also called for systems thinking. And most of the conversation, although it touched on infrastructure and some of those issues, has been about the technology. So my question for you all is two questions relating to the systems aspects of this difficult challenge of creating an alternative vehicle fleet that's sustainable not only ecologically but economically. So the first one is the infrastructure problem, which you've touched on. And whether it's electricity or hydrogen or next-generation biofuels, there's an incompatible fueling infrastructure here. And what we know is that consumers are not going to buy these vehicles unless they can be assured of getting fuel anytime, anywhere, because of the range anxiety. And companies are not going to spend the many, many billions of dollars to articulate that infrastructure unless they're assured of a market. What this creates is a reinforcing feedback or a network externality, which leads to market failure. This is well understood in economics for many, many, many years. That means the market is not going to solve this problem on its own. So while I've worked with GM for years, I appreciate the hedging of the bets by looking at the spectrum of options. That's not the only way to resolve this uncertainty, and in fact, it's going to fail because the infrastructure won't be there and the market will fizzle, as it already has every time people have tried to introduce alternative vehicles. So
I got to push back. What's the answer?
Well, so the alternative is coordination among all the relevant players. So what I'd like to hear is what people, everybody, but especially GM as the OEM on the panel, is doing to coordinate and collaborate with other OEMs, with the state of California, which is the big player in the United States in terms of what it's going to be in the future, with the federal government, to come up with agreed-upon standards and solve that problem and create the certainty that will then lead to the articulation. So that's one. The second
agreed
one has
upon
to,
standards for what now? For you mean a
what
choice
the
of
technology is going to be, what fuel is going to be, how it's going to be delivered.
Well,
so even in electric vehicles, there's no standard yet for fast charging.
Okay, let her answer that one then.
So
let's kind of go for obviously for everyone here, there is a proposal for a new federal standard around 2016. It says which is a corporate average for a fleet. If you're an automaker, you can have a complement, a suite of products, but they have to meet a fuel economy average of this. So that discussion is driving everything you're asking for. Now, much of that is inside baseball. It's not public shareable, but I will tell you the agencies are coordinated, the automakers are coordinated, rich dialogue exchange.
Short of antitrust violations.
Oh well, no! I mean, this is all above board. I mean, this is not done under
Even DOE is co-opted.
But I'm just saying this is something that is so important to the nation that people are working together on. So the best information is being reviewed in the proper settings, and this dialogue's continuing. This will work on ratcheting what technologies, what priorities, and all the other things that go along with it. So
the fuel standards, the CAFE standards will drive the choice of
quite a bit of it because you have
how much electric, how much
you're going to have your mix make that number, right? So I think you're going to have rationalization that will occur just as a result of what's being proposed.
You want to follow up there, John?
So I'm going to let Dan come back on that issue. Let me raise the other systems thinking issue that hasn't come out. And it is quick. Everybody wants to take CO2 out, increase the efficiency, a good thing to do. But I haven't heard any discussion about the direct and indirect rebound effects. So if you make cars cheaper to drive, people will drive more. Now that direct rebound effect is only about 10% more VMT per year.
Right.
But what's most important is the indirect rebound effect. If I switch from driving a 15 mile per gallon SUV, 15,000 miles a year, and I bicycle to work, so I don't do this, but that's the average miles people drive in the United States, to a hybrid or some other alternative vehicle that is much, much cheaper to operate because it's getting the equivalent of 60 or more gasoline equivalent miles per gallon, what am I going to do with the extra money that's now in my pocket? Maybe I use it to pay down my credit card debt. That doesn't have much of an indirect rebound effect. But maybe I take my family on vacation to Disney World. I could easily, by that one trip, increase my family's carbon footprint. So increasing efficiency is not going to solve the climate problem, the carbon problem, the energy dependence problem, unless people are going to also be driving fewer VMTs. Technology isn't going to do it alone. So I haven't heard any calls here for internalizing those externalities other than your general call, which I completely agree with, but specific policies, I'd like to hear what the proposals are. Is it a cap and trade? Is it a carbon tax?
For the audience's benefit, what's happened to VMT when the price of gasoline went up? What happened? And when 2008, when I'll call it our
But that's exactly the point.
That's the opposite of what he's saying.
The efficiency of the fleet didn't change. Prices went up, people drove less.
Right.
You double the efficiency, your operating cost goes down, people are going to drive more.
Yeah, you should come to the session with Emil Lovins and ask him that question.
Well, I think I don't want to take all this on with you, but I think sometimes I hear this causation on VMT, and what, variable A to B, and I'm not sure I buy it that much.
So
I
the
think
direct rebound effect, it's only about 10%. It's the indirect rebound effect. You put more disposable income in people's pockets. They're going to use it in ways that...
You're assuming these vehicles are cheaper, and that's a huge assumption.
Cheaper to use.
You're not going to get people, I drove the Volt yesterday. I loved it.
Thank you.
But at $41K for an MSRP, even after the $7,500 credit, it's much more expensive than a car of comparable capacity.
I think we got to let the next questioner go, and we should
I just
have
want
this
to
debate.
say, I do want to reemphasize that it's uncertain. I mean, what you describe as the indirect rebound effect, I don't know, but it is true that it does have to be combined in this case by pricing the system. I mean, that's got to be it's got to be a factor. I don't mean to suggest that it discourages that directly, but in a sense it does. You do have to have other factors that influence demand on the system, but it's a risk.
I'd like to propose a scenario.
Okay.
And again, back to electric vehicles and all electric vehicles. If you had a car, and I think Mary Beth has already pointed out, again, I want to reemphasize, the one anxiety about electric vehicles is range. You solve the range problem, and now the vehicle itself is not so expensive because it's an electric motor, it's a battery, and if you get the battery cost down, which is what happens, then all of a sudden things are different. All you need is one major auto company, maybe even not one of the bigger ones, but a medium-sized company, to adapt the technology and put a vehicle on the market. Now you have people buying all-electric cars that have the range, so you've gotten over that anxiety. They can charge at home. You don't need an infrastructure. You no longer have a carbon footprint. That's not part of the equation, other than the power generation itself, which I contend should be all solar anyway. So the conversations tend to go back to fossil fuels, and we gravitate to that because that's something we understand. But I think introducing something that changes the dynamics is what we should be focused on.
That's a good point.
Sir. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't even see all of it. Okay. Yeah.
Lonnie, I'm Eric Cephas with Catamount Institute in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Lonnie, I agree with you. It needs to be a dynamic shift, and I believe that is what's going to happen. Two little points of reference for Shell. From the sugarcane side, sugarcane is a weed, grows really well in a rainy place, fertile soils of Brazil. Brazil's been using ethanol, which is a lot lower power density than gasoline and diesel. They've been doing that for many, many years because they couldn't get gasoline. So they've been running their economy on that. Nothing new. It's been going on for a long time. I'm a little frustrated with the talk of hydrogen. Done a lot of work in the automotive realm. I'm an engineer. You don't get your physics exemption card when you do hydrogen. There are so many insurmountable obstacles that people from General Motors have talked about in many automotive conferences. There's a reason why it's not well supported within Department of Energy, but for some reason it's a late cool soundbite that people keep grabbing onto. So I really do think we need to get beyond there. We always seem to lag a little bit behind Europe on some of their efficiencies. Why, from a policy standpoint, why from an automotive standpoint? When I've traveled back and forth to Europe, I always get a diesel. It is fun to drive. I get phenomenal fuel economy. There's many options for looking at biofuels as it relates to diesel because of the power density. Why aren't we focused more on diesel for the short to medium term?
Oh, that's a good question. Mary Beth?
Well, consumers walk into the showroom, and by and large, when they see a fantastic diesel, and I agree, I love diesel products too. I love the range extension the fuel provides, and I think that just what you can put diesel vehicles in is great. When consumers generally come in and they see the price point for the engine plus the emissions management, they go back to the gasoline engine and buy it over and over in this country. So you can't ask us to overinvest into something when the consumer always seems to make that.
Diesels are more expensive for the same car, you're saying?
Yes, they are.
How much?
But it's a different engine. You get that range extension he discussed. I mean, diesel fuel is an elegant fuel. It takes you far. And now with the emissions management system, it's very clean. So it's a very good news story. But by and large in this country, when the consumer walks in, they see the two and they want the diesel and they buy the gasoline.
What about those more available? Because the only people, Audi sells one and Volkswagen, those are the only two diesel manufacturers. And those two dealers, they cannot keep those cars in stock.
There's actually even VW, who's a very excellent company and sells a lot of diesel, is selling more gasoline vehicles here. It's just a market here.
Let me come back to the biofuels question because it's an interesting one. First of all, you're absolutely right. Ethanol has been part of the Brazilian economy and the mobility economy for many years. Part of the reason why we've made our first big play there. But I think what's kind of new in the space is the extent of engagement and investment by a major oil in that space. And even more importantly, we're looking at our experience in Brazil as a stepping stone to next generation. So a lot of work that we're doing, in fact, we folded in many of our next generation R&D plays into that JV so that we can use that JV as the sugarcane JV as a platform for moving into the next generation. In fact, I was struck, Lonnie, by your comment around the importance of entrepreneurs as the source of breakthrough thinking. We actually partner with many entrepreneurs in that next generation biospace in order to capture some of that. But the European observation is an interesting one as well. I was just in Berlin last week at Michelin's Challenge Bibendum, which Shell sponsors. It's a big showcase for kind of sustainable vehicles. What was very interesting about that is that the exhibits were all about electric vehicles and hybrids and lots of really cool hardware. The conversations behind closed doors was all about biofuels. And it was interesting to me that just within the last 6 to 12 months, there's been kind of a shift back towards focusing on bio, at least in that 10, 15-year range, as the solution to some of the sustainability and CO2 issues. So I found that just as an observer and a participant in the event quite interesting.
Let's go to the next question over here. I want to get through a few more questions. You want to talk? All right,
One
quick.
last comment about Brazil. I think it's an excellent example, one that I hadn't thought about until now, but take away gasoline and human ingenuity will find an alternate solution. And I think that policymakers should keep that in mind when we tend to resign ourselves to fossil fuels and CO2.
Okay.
I'm Andy Hoffman. I'm at the University of Michigan. We have doctoral students too, and right down the road from you. I want to talk about geopolitics.
Geopolitics. Speak up a little bit.
The conversation seems to focus on one end of the equation. We need to get off foreign oil because of the geopolitics. It's very dangerous. But no one's talking about the other side of the equation of what kind of mess we're getting ourselves into by moving to these alternative technologies. More benignly, whenever I hear sugarcane ethanol, I hear Brazil. When I hear lithium, I hear Bolivia. When I start to hear rare earth metals, then things start to get really dicey. And about a year and a half ago, if you remember, when Japan grabbed that Chinese fishing boat that crossed into their waters, the first thing China did was cut off shipments of rare earth metals. What are the geopolitical nightmares that you see by shifting to these technologies that you're talking about? Are we trading one devil for another?
Yeah, who are you directing that towards, though?
Anyone who wants to answer it.
Maybe. It's a risk. No, I don't claim to know enough about it, but these are all dependent on different technologies, on different minerals that exist in certain places, and I don't know the answer to that. And it is
the China-Africa nexus is
Sorry?
huge. The China-Africa nexus is huge. China, you go to Africa right now. China is moving in a very serious way for these minerals, for these rare earth metals.
Well, we just actually had an article on rare earths, so I know a
It's
tiny
great.
journalist bit about it. But
That's a good
right
consensus.
now, China has a lock on the market. But that's kind of an artifact of the fact that they were so cheap that they drove it. There's a big mine in California that closed, and that's now in the process of reopening because the price has gone up because China's acting the way it's acting. There are other deposits. I don't believe the shortage of rare earth. There's quite a lot of rare earth still to be exploited. I mean, I'm not saying it's not a problem, but it's also not a problem just
cheap.
for cars.
Yeah.
It's amazing the variety of things rare earths are in.
It just seems to me we're using the argument on one side of the equation, but not on the other.
Well,
But
But,
don't
I
assume-
turn it around a little bit and say, this is a good, opportunity to say, let's all get around Ames Lab in Iowa, who are working on abilities to have great hybrids and great functionality without rare earth. So, I mean, we can get our heads around this by supporting the organizations who've been on the job.
But
That's how I turn that one around.
And don't assume that geopolitical challenges are insurmountable. If I think of the current model of just around fossil fuels, just using that as an example, a company like Shell or BP or ExxonMobil, global networks dealing with a wide variety of different nations, and sometimes people sort of assume, well, big multinationals, kind of goes in the evil column, but actually in this sort of case, what we find is the ability to integrate that upstream, downstream global network allows us to actually be a very, very positive influence with national oil companies, with governments that may be frankly difficult to deal with, but the ability that we have to connect, draw that sort of network of different geopolitical players together actually kind of moves things in a positive direction in many ways.
Okay, thanks for your question.
As my question keeps evolving, I'm going to yield to Dan for the next question.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the
It is
researcher
beginning to
from
feel very
California.
testimonial.
Just say thank you.
Thank you, but I'm not sure why you would yield. Our senator just left.
This is the second person to yield his time to you. This better be a good question.
And I actually really, at heart, wanted to just second what John said. I think that not only the systems feature, but figuring out these pressure points, I think is the big. I mean, I like Neil, your last point about using the power of big firms. And we had a session yesterday on rare earths where there are a couple that are in short supply, but they're almost all in short supply for a given company's short-term business plan. They're not in short supply in terms of the overall evolution of what we can do. The opening of the California mine is one of many examples. Alberta's doing the same thing, et cetera. So with lots of neat stuff, let me just focus on one thing that pulls some of this together, and that is that, and I say we in California, although I'm not officially speaking for California at the moment, there's a strong effort in California to do what you said, to try to say, let's try to drive the market with a major push for a lot of what we think are, in the long term, going to be the more sustainable choice. And I'll leave the biofuel story. I'm worried about some of the statements about biofuels, because it doesn't matter if you're 1 inch or 1,000 miles from the Amazon. The indirect land use effect, just like the indirect rebound effect, there's no spatial linkage. It is a market linkage. And so there's real worries about, well, we think we're isolated from this problem area, that we're not isolated. I mean, this is a place where the global commodity markets are flat. But if I highlight one feature, so California's push, which is just one effort here, is to say we want to make a play for as many of these advanced vehicles as we can. And the current numbers being talked about in the state are on order of the total assessed availability, U.S. production and imports for 5 years. So significant numbers, and on the order of a fraction of a million new low carbon vehicles. A lot electric, some of the best fuel cell and biofuel vehicles as well. Here's the question. California wrote a standard. I'm guilty for having written it, the low carbon fuel standard. And it required a 1% decarbonization each year in the first period, in the first 10 years, of the carbon in the fleet overall. And it was designed to be technology neutral, so people who are pushing EVs, people pushing biofuel vehicles, people pushing the HEMI-efficient engines can all find a place to play. We will do the life cycle analysis, assess them, and then you play into the market as is. And California got sued by several of the Detroit automakers. And so the claim that the last governor and the current governor made was, please send us your engineers, not your lawyers. Right? And the version of that I want to highlight is California dearly would have loved to have gotten more and more input from GM, from Ford, from everyone in terms of the design process. And we had lots of hearings, and the sordid history of ZEV.
I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not agreeing with your history here. So
okay, well, so even if we leave the history aside, where there can be different versions of history, I guess, is that the desire at this point is to find ways to maximize the amount of low-carbon transport options, whether it's individual vehicles, more mass transit, better housing plans. And California has a law linking its greenhouse gas law to its land use planning law. What we're looking for is exactly what Lonnie said. Find the places where one or two firms collaborating with several municipalities can open those doors. And it's designed to be as technology neutral as possible. And again, we all have quibbles on different pieces of it. Why aren't initiatives like that, and what New York might be trying to do next, the places where there's the most interest for GM, Shells, Fords, and all to take that leading role? And that's what I think we're trying to get.
That's why I'm really struggling with it. That's those statements, because to me, forgive me, I don't know you, and this is not personal, but it sounds very revisionist history to me. We have had GM engineers and Ford engineers in California, and they're there daily.
That's very true.
and working with Mary Nichols, and I'm there all the time working on clean fuels outlet alternatives. Right. So I take a little exception that we're absent from the discussion.
No, I didn't say absent. I said absent on the
All
engineering.
right, why don't we focus on the substance debate? Is you're saying California is pushing a standard that would require decarbonization of the car fleet,
right?
Whether it's through electrification, hybridization, or whatever.
And
you're saying the car manufacturers do object to this. Is that correct?
We're in there participating. We're at the table.
You are not suing California.
No, we had no lawsuits were dropped.
Those lawsuits were just dropped, right?
And they were not because of the low carbon fuel standard. It was prior to that.
Okay.
And then now that we're focused on 2016 on one federal standard, lawsuits were dropped, and we're all at the table.
Okay.
It's a good news story.
What's the suit was based on emissions.
Yeah, I mean it was not low carbon fuel.
Yeah,
that's a new advent and a good one, and we're there.
So that's really the question. What are the places where states, regions can say, we see vehicle technology, we see policy coming together, and we think that the U.S. could be the lead developer, the exporter of these. That's really what.
Well, I think that's a really good question, because he's saying, how states that are activist, states like New York, California, how are they playing in this? California always being on the leading edge of getting us down to a greater fuel economy, different fuels. Again, I think participating in this one national standard is significant. If you really want to win at the end of the day, you can have universal deployment around the country, so we don't have to have his and her models for the state of California and other states. Right. So you get the affordable vehicle, and it's one national standard. So I think playing at the federal level, which you are, is the right way to go.
Remind us what the standard is, please.
It is in discussion. It is not decided. It's been a proposed rulemaking of increased fuel economy standard starting in 2016.
To what?
It's right now proposed at 62 on a fleet average, but again, it's...
Fleet average of 62 miles per gallon by the 2016 model year is under discussion.
Around that. It's
not by 2016.
Not by
it would
then.
be what would succeed 2016.
It would be a year of initiation. So, again, I think for the first time, I think people are having really rich and data-driven discussions. So I think we're in a better place than around we'll call it 15 years ago, when there was a concern about...
GM is not opposed to such a standard.
No.
All right.
I do...
Well, when you get to... It depends on what the mix will look like. And you will probably see, certainly, an SUV, as you know, getting down more to, more of a smaller vehicle. I don't think you can keep the fleet at the size you can if you're working towards those numbers.
Dan, your question becomes even more complex if we pan back to the global level, of course. And just for the record, Shell is also involved in those conversations in California. But when we look across the sort of the global patchwork of different approaches, it gets really complicated, because we've long supported a CO2-based standard for fuels, but the different ways in which that can get applied start to get mind-blowing when you're trying to manage a global infrastructure, and that's that just takes it to the next level of complexity.
I just briefly want to mention we can't separate this discussion from broader political concerns, political goals, and so forth, because I do think the CAFE standards continue to be a strong motivating factor, obviously, in driving technology, whatever the outcomes may be. And this is in an atmosphere in which, there are a lot of people who have very strong views about regulation and just regulation in general. And I think there's a real question. I think there continues to be support, generally sufficient support, broadly for the CAFE standards and CAFE regulation and using that regulatory regime. But it is in a context in which there seems to be reaction against regulation and big government, quote unquote. And I think we have to be sensitive to the broader political environment here, which affects...
Are you saying you're not sure the current Congress would accept a 62 mile an hour, 62 miles per gallon?
I'm not sure. I don't want to say 62. I mean, clearly, there are elements in this Congress that are moving against the emissions standards that were incorporated after MASFI versus EPA.
Right.
So far, there does not seem to be pushback on the CAFE standards, which are going to 36 or something, give or take, by 2016, but I do have a little nervousness about not so much that standard, which I think can be preserved, but the drive to continue to use that regulatory regime to drive technological innovation, whatever form it may take.
We have to hurry and have two last questions.
First of all, Lonnie, great takeaway point. You get what you work on. Real good one-liner for me to take away. Having driven the Volt yesterday, I think borrowing a page out of Dan Kammen's book on systems thinking, one of the things we really didn't get into at all was the advanced energy storage capability of a large fleet of very well equipped cars that can feed back into the grid when called upon. And that will allow for renewables firming. There are all sorts of things, energy security. But I actually wanted to respond to the gentleman over here that talked about hydrogen. And I have to tell a little story of how I really got my gray hair. I put an awful lot of time and money and effort into hydrogen 10 years ago. And just to give you a real example, I launched hydrogen.com. I launched a magazine called Hydrogen Magazine. My 1-800 number is still 1-800-HYDROGEN. It's true. I did not get a tattoo. But clearly I thought about it because I didn't get the tattoo. But what I want to say is that going back to natural gas and the fact that actually there is a very, very good infrastructure in this country in addition to our grid, which is the natural gas pipes that go up and down every street in America. So one of the other things that I did was invest in a company, and it's all history now, but it's called H2Gen, and it was very much about putting a small-scale steam methane reformer at the site where it was needed. And, of course, other things happened, but the idea was why not reform at the point of demand, which is the gas station, and work with the oil companies, work with the auto companies, and make hydrogen readily available. There was one small issue, and Dan has a very good distinction between green hydrogen and non-green hydrogen. If we could strip out, have a small CCS, carbon capture and storage of the carbon that came off that unit, then we'd be producing green hydrogen. So I just want to say that there are, the plot thickens. I mean, we've got a lot of different options here, and don't discount, as one of you said, the ability for a really highly motivated entrepreneur, and would love to have something, a horse in the race at some point, but there are others even better placed than I to jump in and say, we're going to take this and we're going to work with all of you and we're going to make it happen. So I hope that can happen. Anyway. Okay. The gentleman in the...
Did we wear you out over there? No.
I didn't know for sure if I could.
All right, you get the last question.
Zane Frost from Lost Cabin, Wyoming. And all of our discussions here today and the elimination of carbon and all this is wonderful. I think that agriculture provides, for every farmer, they feed roughly 93 to 100 and some people in the world. What are the implications for agriculture? We're talking about tractors, we're talking about combines, we're talking about transport trucks. Can you help me out here a little bit?
How do we green the combine or the tractor?
Yeah,
can we run them on
I
batteries?
I appreciate your concerns.
Yeah.
Let's just go for it right now.
The only thing I've heard, and it's because this is something I'm a little closer to, is the relation to heavy-duty trucks, which I don't think there may be people here who disagree, who most people don't think electrification is the answer for, let's say, heavy-duty trucks, and I imagine that may be the same for construction equipment and so forth.
Lonnie objects.
Yeah, well, that's...
Can you run those oil sand steam shovels in Alberta off solar-powered batteries, maybe?
I just quickly, what I have heard is the possibilities of natural gas being used for that, which is a fossil fuel, but obviously less polluting, lower greenhouse gas emissions. That's the only thing. There is I think rulemaking is probably too strong. There's a process, the last energy bill required NHTSA and other agencies to look at the development of fuel standards for heavy-duty vehicles. Yeah, so that process has begun.
I think the answer in the long term will be cost-effective solar. There is a lot of talk about distributed power generation, off-grid power generation, feeding back to the grid and so forth. When we can make farms independent and rely on the sun as the energy source, and then have batteries to power, and batteries that are efficient efficient both cost-wise and performance-wise, enough to power your combines and so forth, that becomes the ideal solution, because then you have total control of your destiny.
But you can get enough power out of one of these things in principle to power a big
machine.
machine.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's just it's just expensive storage, which is the harebrained.
Yeah. Neil, did you want to add something?
Not necessarily to this question. I can't add much to that. But if you don't mind, I would like to come back to just very briefly the question around who's having the systemic conversations. And in that context, I'd like to put in a plug for this audience, quite frankly, because what I observe is that in bringing together these kinds of groups, that conversation is happening. And Shell comes to these kinds of venues, to Aspen events, to Andrew's Montreux Energy Roundtable events, to find out, to learn about all of the kinds of systemic issues that are associated with this, because none of these things are going to be solved by one company, by one sector, by consumers alone, by policymakers alone. It is going to be a collaborative process, and every one of these conversations is helpful to us in establishing what we need to be competitive in the middle of this century. We know the current model that we're operating under is not going to be sustainable in the middle of the century. We know it's not going to be what's going to make us competitive in a leading energy company. And so these kinds of conversations help us to make sure that we're laying down that pathway to getting to a better, more sustainable place.
Well, that's a good note to stop on. Let's thank the panel very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
It was great.
Enjoyed it. I hope it